So this presentation is going to go over the four main philosophical foundations that are influencing curriculum and instruction in American education today. The first one is perennialism, which is your oldest philosophy. Um, it's rooted in a lot of realism and a lot of ancient um, kind of thinking, and it's very traditional, but it has a major influence in education as it dominated American education up until the early 1990s. It's all about a common cultural heritage or the sharing of great works in each subject area. So it's more about commonality. So it's this idea of, for example, in literature class in high school, all students will be reading Shakespeare. So I'm sure many of us have experienced reading Romeo and Juliet. That would be a perennialist philosophy of education, the idea that we all should read these great works. Or in science, we should learn about the great theories of Isaac Newton and things like that. But it's the idea of commonality and of knowledge. There was a big revival in the 20th century. It was a rebuttal against the progressive child-centered movement, which I will talk about later. One individual in particular is Hutchins from the University of Chicago. He based a lot of his philosophy on his experiences over at Yale Law School, and he is known as one of the top perennialists in philosophy of education. Um, it's all about a classical liberal arts education and a hierarchical instruction. So it's the very formal idea of education, where the teacher imparts information. All students take your math, your social studies, your science, and your English. Even at the college level, it's this idea of all students across the country are educated in the same content and same subject areas. A lot of the principles are based on permanence, the idea of not unchanging and stable knowledge. So it's the idea of these intellectual skills that all students should have, regardless of any differences in their gender or ethnicity or anything like that. It's more about stability and commonality. So some of the important works was Adler's Padilla proposal, which is the Socratic method of teaching. So the idea of a teacher as the knowledge that imparts on the students, then the students then discuss these great ideas and share in the common building of intellectual knowledge. And Bloom wrote about the closing of the American mind. He wrote more about the university level, but the idea of ensuring that all students that attend post-secondary education receive a liberal arts education. And again, Hutchins, there's his name again, and then two others, Adler as well and Barr, all had a major impact, known as major perennialists. So they're the ones that are sort of the forefathers of this philosophy in recent times. Medical science education has a priority in perennialism. The idea of the unchanging knowledge of science and medicine, which does change, but at the same time, there's some basic intellectual knowledge that they think they need to impart. And that study was recently, I think in 2018. And the idea of perennialism is in education as we see it in the idea of universal education for everybody. So it's this idea of all students across the country get these, English and math and social studies and science, and a lot of the knowledge is very similar across the nation, no matter what school you enter. And that is a perennialist view of education, so their obvious influence can be seen in that aspect. Now, closely related to perennialism would be essentialism. Essentialism is all about mastering the basic subject skills, facts, and concepts. So, a little bit different than perennialism, but certainly closely related. And it's this idea that, traditional educators believe U.S. society is fragmented if we don't gather together, and if we need to get rid of those child-centered theories and focus on the basics of reading and writing and math. And this is a support for low-income students because a lot of the criticism of the progressive type movement was that it was catered toward upper class students who had this knowledge already at home, and the schools didn't cover it, whereas other students needed some of these basic skills. And so whenever you hear like a back to basics kind of thing, that would be essentialism. Now, a lot of us probably have seen a lot of these recent proposals and legal decisions with No Child Left Behind, the Common Core standards race to the top, and all the standards-based movement are based on this essentialist philosophy, the idea of essential back to basic skills. Very traditional in the sense that it is disciplined, it's homework, it's studying, it's very academic driven. So like perennialism, it's all about building those intellectual skills, but even more so in terms of learning basic skills of reading and writing and math. And just like perennialism, the teacher is the authority figure, they're the master of the subject area, and they're the ones that students should emulate. So some of the principles, again, the back to basics is essentialism, cultural literacy, okay, a commonality of all Americans, and an excellence in education. Again, that competitiveness, being number one in the world on, reading and writing on the standardized test. Okay, and again, teacher is the authority figure and your basics, your reading, your writing, and your math. There were some of the major theorists. Hirsch, being a big one, talked about the cultural literacy, the idea of effective communication within the culture, and that all students need to have these basic things in order to flourish in American society. And it's a promoting of society's goals. So it's a commonality. It's a community. The common culture and the values and beliefs are objective, and this is what everybody needs to know and believe and feel. So it's outside of other areas. It's a very economic way of education. So it's very business oriented. The idea of supply and demand, or more so the idea of connecting, this piece to that to make a profit. So it's really this, kind of industrialized view of education would be under the essentialist view. Now, the more contemporary starts with progressivism. Now, a lot of schools of education use this progressive philosophy of education, whereas a lot of the policies in the politics seem to use more of the essentialist and perennialist, which there is some of the clash we may see in education between educators and some of the decision makers, because progressivism is sort of the antithesis to that. The progressive movement, it's all about experiencing the world. So your formal education begins with the family, the parents, the child, and their interests. In school, improve society. It's not just about learning about society, but it's about being an active member of the society. So that child-centered focus is a major part of the progressive movement. And the idea is emphasizing how to think and not what to think. So John Dewey, who is a big name in the progressive movement, sees this as democracy and education going hand in hand. Learning how to think, learning to change the world, learning to be a part of the society. So this is where the demands for individualized instruction, new courses of information, of interest, and not focusing so hard on the standards, but focusing more on the child. So some of it was split into three major school of thoughts. You got your child-centered, you got your activity-centered, and then creative and neo-Freudian. You got humanistic and the radical school reform. They were all, kind of a little different, but there were certainly similarities, as they were opposed to the authoritarian teaching and the over-reliance on textbooks and facts. The idea was to look at the changing world and allow those experiences to play a major role in the child's education. So the humanistic curriculum It's a reaction to that subject, okay? It's this idea of what are the needs of the person. And the radical school reform was all about, changing the schools and not making it discriminatory, and how the standards and the essentials, so to speak, were somewhat discriminatory towards other students, particularly minority and low-income students. So there were some of the major theorists who believed in this progressive, everyone from Thomas Jefferson to John Dewey. So again, it's all about the child and the individual, and it's all about promoting a democratic and social living. So the idea of building a society, being democratic, and being a part of the civics of America, and it goes hand in hand. And John Dewey viewed school as a miniature democratic society, and we can certainly see these influences in our education system today, especially when you look at things like special education law. The idea of students with learning disabilities getting those individualized attention comes from a very progressivist philosophy of education. And the final philosophy is Reconstructionism. And this is similar to progressivism, but it's more about addressing the social questions and improving society as a whole. So it goes from the individual to a more Marxist kind of view of improving all of society. So the emphasis is on the social sciences, the economics, political problems, and really allowing students to learn how to change these things. It's the idea of Reconstructionism is to reconstruct society. And some of the big works where you got Dare the School and Build a New Social Order, George Counts, a criticism of the progressive era, and a big proponent of teacher unions, which is a big part of education today. So the war on poverty, civil rights movements, and things like that help. We're all under this Reconstruction philosophy of education. And this is where critical pedagogy comes from. The idea of students, need to think, need to question, and need to be critical of the world around them. And they're a major part of protecting this democracy, and being a part of globalism and reconceptualism, like a worldwide view of changing society and the view. So the programming of Reconstructionists, they want to examine society's culture heritage, not just accept it as objective, but to analyze it, break it apart, question it, and criticize it. Forward thinking, and allow students and teachers to recreate the world, so to speak. Globalist, again, it's a very similar thing, but it's more on a global scale. So recognizing that America is just a small part of the world. And the idea of reconceptualist is not just changing American society at the local level, but at a global level, and realizing the connection between all human beings on the planet. There were some of your main proponents of the reconceptualization or reconceptualist theory of education. And again, it's on resolving problems, problem-based education. So, you want to offer, like this individual, Coleman, the same curriculum to all children. The difference being it's not like subject-oriented, it's more student-oriented, and things problem posing and how we can change the world through schooling. So some of the influences came from, this is where, school desegregation, multicultural education, and again, the idea of, students with disabilities deserving the same free and appropriate education that students with non-disabilities have. So that is the idea of the reconceptualist. So as you can see, all four of these philosophies have had a major influence in American society, and we are all, in education in particular, and we are all juggling between these four to kind of find the best method for curriculum and instruction for all students. And there were our references for this presentation.